Welcome to the OHSS SHE Rep course. The following course is designed for SHE Reps within any organization. The course is mainly taken from sections 17 to 20 of the Occupational Health and Safety Act. We will discuss the roles and responsibilities of a SHE Rep, as well as understand how you can achieve a higher culture of health and safety by taking ownership of your own health and safety. Please watch all 4 videos and then answer the questions. And if you need help, please get in touch on info@ohss.co.za. Enjoy. Every organization has a general duty or obligation of care on the employer and employees in the workplace, and on anyone who designs, manufactures, imports, or supplies any plant or substances to a workplace. Occupational health and safety also covers issues such as how to resolve OHS issues and the roles of and election process, where applicable, for health and safety committees as well as health and safety representatives. Under the Act, employers are responsible not only for the safety of their employees, but also for the safety of any other people in the workplace. Owners of an organization, including their board of management, have a legal responsibility toward health and safety. These include nominating a responsible officer and ensuring that the legal obligations of the facility are met. This will include establishing and maintaining health and safety systems, appropriate resourcing of the facility to ensure safe work practices, and developing and implementing company policies that support health and safety. Within the Occupational Health and Safety Act of 1993, we see the following objective: to provide for the health and safety of persons at work and for the health and safety of persons in connection with the use of plant and machinery, the protection of persons other than persons at work against hazards to health and safety arising out of or in connection with the activities of persons at work, and then to establish an advisory council for occupational health and safety, and finally, to provide for matters concerned therewith. There are also 21 supporting regulations that we need to consider. As health and safety representatives, you should know and fully understand the legal register for your company. The legal register dictates which regulations affect your scope of work. For instance, if you are working within an industry that uses any electrical equipment, then the electrical machinery regulations may affect you. Perhaps you are working in an area where you are using hazardous chemical substances. In that instance, the hazardous chemical substance regulations will also affect you. A legal register is an outline of which regulations affect your scope of work. Then, we divulge into the regulation to see if there are any appointments, policies, procedures, risk assessments, or even training that needs to be adhered to ensure that you comply with that regulation. If you are not sure which regulations affect your company, please get in touch with us telling us what your scope of work is, what type of industry you are working in, and perhaps we can assist you in designing your legal register to make it simpler for you and your company to adhere and comply with the entire Occupational Health and Safety Act, as well as each applicable regulation. Let us now take a look at certain sections of the OHS Act, what they deal with, and also what they mean for you as a health and safety representative. Starting off with Section 7, the Health and Safety Policy. Let us start at Section 7 of the OHS Act. This deals with a health and safety policy. The Chief Inspector may direct any employer in writing and any category of employers by notice of the Gazette to prepare a written policy concerning the protection of the health and safety of his employees at work, including a description of his organization and the arrangements for carrying out and renewing that policy. Any direction under subsection 1 shall be accompanied by guidelines concerning the contents of the policy concerned. An employer shall prominently display a copy of the policy referred to in subsection 1, signed by the Chief Executive Officer in the workplace where his employees normally report for service. In short, it means that each company in South Africa has a responsibility toward the occupational health and safety of its employees and any person who may be affected by their works. Thus, government requires companies to develop their own commitment to OHS by designing and sticking to a policy of OHS. This health and safety policy must be documented, include a description of their organization, include the arrangements for carrying out the policy, include the arrangements for reviewing the policy, include guidelines concerning the contents of the policy. This could be methodologies on how the company will carry out the contents of the policy. It must also be prominently displayed where the company's employees report for work. In other words, it should be visible to employees at a point where all employees can see this policy. Now let's take a delve into the duties of employers to their employees under Section 8 of the OHS Act. Let's now have a look at Section 8 of the OHS Act, the duty of the employer toward their employees. Section 8.1 starts off by saying that every employer shall or must provide and maintain, as far as is reasonably practicable, a working environment that is safe and without risk to the health of his employees. Let us stop and look up the meaning of reasonably practicable. This means having practicable regard to the severity and scope of the hazard or risk concerned, the state of knowledge reasonably available concerning that hazard or risk, or any means of removing or mitigating that hazard or risk, the availability and suitability of means to remove or mitigate that hazard and risk, and the cost of removing or mitigating that hazard or risk in relation to the benefits deriving therefrom. Now moving on to Section 8.2, it says that without derogating from the generality of the employer's duties under subsection 1, meaning that the overall responsibility that they have toward health and safety, we cannot take away from that. But the matters to which those duties refer include in particular. In other words, it is now telling the employer specifically what must be done in terms of health and safety. And this is also a very good key or a very good guide in order to develop a good health and safety policy. Let's start by looking at 8.2a, the provision and maintenance of systems of work, plant and machinery that, as far as is reasonably practicable, are safe and without risks to health. So yes, it's not just the provision of a system of work or a safe system of work, but also the maintenance of such a system. This maintenance of the system means a continuous, ongoing methodology to ensure that the systems that have been put in place, or the processes to keep people safe, are continually looked at, continually monitored, continually reviewed to ensure that employees are safe. Always looking at it from a reasonable and practical aspect. The next aspect is looking at taking steps, again, as may be reasonable and practical, to eliminate or mitigate any hazard or potential hazard to the safety or health of employees before resorting to personal protective equipment. This HIRA program, or hazard analysis and risk assessment, or hazard identification, and risk assessment helps us to analyze what health and safety hazards or dangers there are that could impact employees. We then look at reasonable and practical measures to first of all eliminate these completely. If this is not possible, we move over to a mitigation. Mitigation means to make safer. And so we use a hierarchy of control. A hierarchy of control helps us to start with the safest way of doing something and slowly move to a less safe. So as you noticed in section 2b, it says that you eliminate or mitigate before resorting to personal protective equipment. In other words, PPE is the last resort. Before resorting to PPE, we want to try and make the work our employees do as safe as possible. Point C says making arrangements for ensuring, again as far as reasonably practicable, the safety and absence of risks to health in connection with the production, processing, use, handling, storage, or transport of articles or substances. And so whether you are manufacturing such articles or substances, or whether you are using them, handling them, or storing them, or transporting them from one place to the next, these substances will pose a risk to your employees. And so we want to ensure that there is complete safety and absence of risk to health to our employees when using any articles or substances. This could be in the case of lacquer thinners. If you had to buy thinners for your employees to use while working on site, then how are they supposed to use it? You see, the start of this point says making arrangements for ensuring the safety and absence of risks. These arrangements are not just passive, but also active processes to help employees understand how to use them, how to handle them, where and how to store them, how to transport these. So when it comes down to the health and safety of our staff, our employees, or anyone else that may be affected by the risks and hazards that are exposed to ourselves on site and the scope of work we perform, we want to make arrangements for ensuring the safety of these risks to health. Then section 8.2d starts with establishing, so we need to now find out, again, as far as is reasonable, what hazards to the health or safety of persons are attached to any work which is performed, any article, any substance which is produced, processed, used, handled, stored, or transport, and any plant or machinery which is used in your business. And you shall or must, again, as far as reasonably practical, further establish what precautionary measures should be taken with respect to such work. Again, not just the work, but any articles, substances, plants, machinery, in order to protect the health and safety of persons. Now notice it says safety of persons and not just employees, and that is because we are not just looking after the health and safety of the employees performing that work. We are looking at the health and safety of any person who may be exposed to the dangers that that work will provide. And then it says that the CEO or the employer shall or must provide the necessary means to apply such precautionary measures. Again, here we are being told to look at what hazards to the health and safety of persons are attached to any work which is performed. This is an overall holistic approach to risk management. We need to find out what risks and hazards our entire scope of work of the company is going to not just affect our employees, but affect any person. And this will include the use of tools, the use of machinery, any use, handling, or stored, processed, or transported article or substance, as we mentioned in point C. Then any use of plant or machinery inside the business or outside the business in order to perform our scope of work. In other words, whatever you are doing, whether it is an actual process or a new process, whatever you need to do in order to keep your company running is a part of this work which is performed. It could even start with a very reception area where we have a person welcoming our clients, our customers, or any visitor off the road. Have we seen, have we checked, have we established what safety hazards there are to these persons? Have we then taken a look at the individual visiting us as well? Look at the visitor, the client, the customer that comes through to you. Is there any exposure to danger when they arrive on site? All of this needs to be written down. Then we need to find a good way to prevent them from being injured on site, getting ill health on site, or any of the risks and hazards that we are exposed to in our company affecting any other person. Now we move over to 8.2e. This says that an employer must provide such information, instructions, training, and supervision as may be necessary to ensure, again as far as reasonably practicable, the health and safety of persons at his work. When we provide information, instruction, training, and supervision, this is all in the interest of keeping a person safe. So from the information side of it, it is all information. As you notice, it's the information that may be necessary to ensure the health and safety of persons. This would include information on risks and hazards. Then, the information on the precautionary measures to prevent these risks and hazards from hurting the person. The instruction part of it is a direct methodology. Instructions help us to specifically tell the person what they need to do. So we take information and we add understanding. So we don't just have knowledge of what is happening in the company. We don't just have the knowledge of the risks and the hazards, and we don't just have the knowledge of what to do to keep it safe. But we add that instruction, that specific methodology of how to take that precautionary measure and use it to keep yourself safe. Then we move on to training. This could be in-house training, such as the safety awareness program, the safety induction program for our company, even an employee orientation to help employees get a fay with what is happening in the company, such as training them on the risk assessment, on the articles, substance, plants, machinery, as we heard earlier, and how to protect themselves from these necessary dangers. And supervision as may be necessary. So here could be one of the appointments that an employer can make in terms of a supervisor. We would call this person an 8.2e. And why is that? Well, they are being appointed because the duty of the employer is to appoint them as a Section 8 duty of the employees, subsection 2.e, providing supervision. Yes, so this would then become a point of appointment. You would now have a person appointed as a supervisor under section 8.2e. And this is also how most appointments are done. Reading through legislation, we then identify where it tells us where responsibilities of certain parties are put in place and how we can hand them over or appoint responsible people into those positions, all in order to fulfill legislation. And by fulfilling legislation, we are fulfilling our compliance to legislation. Let's move on to point number F. As far as is reasonably practicable, not permitting any employee to do any work or to produce, process, use, handle, store, or transport any article or substance, or to operate any plant or machinery, unless the precautionary measures contemplated in paragraph B and D or any other precautionary measures which may be prescribed have been taken. This does not mean a policing of employees. However, the supervisor that has been appointed should be a competent person, and we'll get to this a little bit later on in this training course. What is a competent supervisor? You see, surely someone who is supervising you should not only know the risks and hazards that you're exposed to, but also how to safely apply precautionary measures in order to protect these employees that they are supervising. So any supervisor should know that if you are working, producing, processing, using, handling, storing, or transporting articles or substances, or if you are operating plant or machinery, that the precautionary measures are known to you and that you are actually working in accordance with these precautionary measures. Let's take the example of working with a forklift. This would be operating a piece of plant. If you had to operate this piece of plant, such as a forklift, then you would no doubt understand, being trained as a forklift operator, that there are certain dangers. Your supervisor should also know the dangers. Perhaps they don't know how to actually operate the forklift, but they will definitely know the dangers of the forklift. Now, why is that? How can a person know the dangers of operating a forklift, but then not be trained in the operation of a forklift? Well, this is where a risk assessment, safe work procedure, method statement, all of these documentation outline how to operate the forklift, what the dangers are in operating the forklift, and then apply to your specific area. Now, what do we mean by that? Well, when you get into a forklift and just operate it in a wide open space, so if you can imagine you're in a warehouse, there is nothing around you, just one big open space warehouse. You're in the center of it, and the walls or any obstacles are kilometers away from you. And so you are in this forklift and you are now operating it. There are specific risks and hazards to operating that forklift, even though there's nothing around you. You see, the forklift itself is a danger. The forklift operation becomes the very exposure to danger or a hazard. And these come with their own risks. Now, supervising you, we would need to know these risks. But not everyone uses a forklift for the exact same thing. Yes, it is used to lift objects, but everyone lifts different objects. And so the supervisor, as well as the operator, must know and understand the various dangers of the applied scope of work. Where are we using that forklift? What are we using it for? What are we lifting? Where are we moving it? All of those specific scopes of work now become what we term site specific. Then the environment that the forklift is in. What is it traveling on? What is it traveling up? Where is it going into? Thinking of your own work area where a forklift might be used, you will then notice quite a few risks and hazards that are in the surrounding environment. All of this must be taken into consideration when working out a risk assessment. when performing an understanding or instruction or giving information on the use of such a forklift in a specific environment. Now, Section F also goes further and says any other precautionary measures which may be prescribed. These may be directly from the manufacturer. You see, the OHS Act doesn't specifically tell us how to operate plant or machinery. And so it states that we need to reasonably and practically, what does that mean again? We need to identify the severity and scope of hazards concerned. We need to also understand what knowledge is available concerning this hazard. What is the availability and suitability of the means to remove that hazard? And then what is the cost of removing it against the benefits that we derive from it? That reasonably practicable attitude is what an employer must have. So it means being active. We do not wait to get that information. Rather, we go and research it. We actually physically take an active part in looking for the safe means, these precautionary measures that must be taken. Then we look at Section 8.2G, taking all necessary measures to ensure that the requirements of this Act are complied with by every person in his employment or on premises under his control where plant or machinery is used. Now notice we are covering any person who may be affected by the dangers of the use of plant or machinery. And so if machinery is being used, any tools are being used on site, and you have somebody that is visiting you on site, they fall under your control. And that is because you're inviting them onto your premises. And as an employer, you are ultimately responsible for anything that happens on that site. So because the risks and hazards that you have outlined and the precautionary measures that are attached to them have been instructed and trained, and you have a supervisor over your employees, you now also need to ensure that any person over and above someone in your employment is also protected from those dangers. So many companies have a specific rule that you cannot work or walk alone around the environment if you are a visitor without somebody being with you from the company. And so you need to ensure that your host or the person that invited you to the company, the person that you are seeing in the company, walks with you while you are in that specific area. All of these are the necessary measures to ensure that the Act is complied with by every person. So supervision is key to ensuring that each person is being compliant to the OHS Act. This means that you need to know what the OHS Act says. You need to understand how to apply the requirements of the OHS Act before you are able to then take necessary measures to ensure that others are doing that. Now notice point H. Enforcing such measures as may be necessary in the interest of health and safety. And so there might come a time where someone is not doing what they are supposed to be doing in terms of health and safety, either by not doing something correctly or by doing something that is not correct. And these acts or omissions by employees or mandatories or any visitor that comes to your site may be a cause that will create a risk or hazard to your company. It may endanger the life of the people around them when they do something or do not do something in the interest of health and safety. And so it is the responsibility of an employer to enforce measures. This means at times that you might have to issue a non-conformance. If somebody does something wrong, you may have to put in a disciplinary procedure in order to show the severity, the weightiness of the actual act, as well as what it is standing for in the interest of health and safety. Now notice section 8.2i. Ensuring that work is performed and that plant or machinery is used under the general supervision of a person trained to understand the hazards associated with it and who have the authority to serve and ensure that precautionary measures are taken by the employer. Now, this person, again, we find another appointment within this piece of legislation. We call this person an 8.2i, someone who is more technically minded, because they now have information that is plant or machinery related. And this person, who is a general supervisor, must be trained to understand the hazards associated with that plant or machinery being used. But notice it also says that they need to have the authority to ensure that precautionary measures are taken by the employer. Now, what is this authority that we are talking about? We are not just saying somebody that has been elected in a high position in the company. When we speak of authority, or when somebody comes across as authoritative, it means that they have the knowledge, understanding. In other words, this person is competent. They know and understand, and so when they speak, they are speaking from a position of authority. And so when we appoint someone into this position in our companies, we want to ensure that this person speaks and uses the knowledge, training, and all the information that they have been given about the risks and hazards specific to the task being performed under the employees who are working, so that when they issue instructions, when they give information, when they train any person under their supervision, they are coming from a place of authority. Now moving on to section J, which is the last point, section 8.2J, causing all employees to be informed regarding their scope of authority. So what is their scope of, what are they allowed to do, what are they not allowed to do, what is their specific job, and what must they do to ensure they comply with this act. Now regarding the scope of their authority as contemplated in section 37 rather, 1b, this is basically stating the acts or omissions, as we mentioned earlier, what they can do and what they are not allowed to do in a company. Now notice again, earlier in section 8.2, we are being told to look at risks, we are being told to look at hazards, and then set out those precautionary measures and ensure that everybody is in compliance with the act, and then taking the necessary precautionary measures, making sure enforcing such measures that may be necessary. All of this comes down again to a reminder, making sure employees know and understand exactly what they need to be doing in relation to health and safety. And this scope of authority is how they are allowed to act and what areas are they not allowed to perform any work that might be dangerous. So let's look at one example. If an employee is appointed as a first aider, you see, you cannot perform any first aid unless you are trained in proper first aid. So as somebody who is trained in first aid, level 1, level 2, level 3, they'll be able to know how to give CPR to a person who is not breathing, whose heart is not beating. And this CPR that needs to be performed can only be done by a trained and qualified person. Their scope of their authority means that if they have a valid certificate, they are allowed to perform CPR in terms of their training. If they are not trained, are they allowed to perform CPR? Absolutely not. If an employee has a company vehicle but does not have a valid South African license, are they allowed to operate that vehicle? No. That would be an unsafe act that could lead to an incident or an accident. And so, we need to ensure that employees are informed regarding the scope of their authority. And why is that? Because they represent you as the employer. And as the employer, you need to ensure that any person under your control are not exposed to the risks and hazards, the dangers of your working environment. In summary, employers are required to provide and maintain a safe working environment, provide and maintain safe plant and systems of work, which would include identifying, assessing, and controlling risks and hazards, providing information, instruction, training, and supervision of employees to ensure health and safety, then ensuring the safe use, storage, and handling of substances or articles, providing adequate facilities for staff in order for their safety and health, as well as the health and safety areas that need to be looked after. And then consult with employees and also consult with health and safety representatives about occupational health and safety. Let us stop for a moment and discuss the purpose of the risk assessment as we've just discussed in section 8.2d of the OHS Act. It is to ensure that the most up-to-date information about the level of health and safety risk posed to persons is available. It also helps to inform the risk manager, risk assessment team, and all employees of the necessary protocols and measures to be taken to prevent and mitigate the potential risks and hazards faced when working within an environment that may expose them to the dangers as stated within the risk assessment. The risk assessment only forms part of the overall risk management plan or risk management system that your company should have in place. The risk assessment procedure that we will discuss forms part of the integrated risk management approach applied to works performed by an employer. Sound and effective environmental health and safety risk management is a leading practice and a means of improving performance objectives of the work going forward. Conducting a risk assessment is a legal requirement in terms of the OHS Act. The results of the risk assessment are to be made available to all interested parties and employees of your company, including any person who may be affected by the risks as stated below in your risk assessment. The objectives of any risk assessment is to identify, analyze, and prioritize the health and safety hazards as well as potentially unwanted events or risks associated with the works in terms of exposure to danger. Secondly, we want to identify engineering type mitigation strategies early. Thirdly, to provide information for improved costing associated with identified mitigation strategies. Fourth, we want to produce and prioritize profile of the potentially unwanted events associated with any scope of works performed. This would form a whole risk assessment. And lastly, we will then develop a critical control management plan for any critically identified hazard. Let us look at a few definitions that you might come across when looking at risk assessments or HIRA in general. ALARP or ALARP, as low as reasonably practicable. The concept of weighing the risk against the sacrifice needed, and to implement the measures necessary to avoid the risk. In health and safety, it is assumed that the measures should be implemented unless it can be shown that the sacrifice is grossly disproportionate to the benefit. Consequence: the outcome of an event or situation expressed qualitatively or quantitatively, whether a loss, injury, health or environment impact, or disadvantage, or a benefit, gain, or advantage. Control or barrier. Control or barrier is defined as anything used to control, prevent, or impede energy flow or the loss of control of a hazard. Types of barriers include physical, equipment design, warning devices, procedures, work processes, knowledge and skills, and supervision. Controls impact on the risk of the event, whether it is an opportunity or threat. It is essential to consider controls or barriers in terms of their order of greatest effectiveness. This order is known as the hierarchy of control. Critical controls. Those controls that significantly influence the likelihood and/or consequence of an event. If removed, they will significantly impact the risk rating. Event. An incident or situation which occurs in a particular place during a particular interval of time. Events involve releases or manifestations of or exposures to the hazard. Events can be wanted, opportunity, or unwanted, threats. Hazard. A source of potential harm to people, facilities, the environment, or the community that leads to unwanted damage. Understanding a hazard includes the nature, magnitude, and potential consequences, as well as relevant target or impact characteristics, potential timeframes, pathways or mechanisms of its manifestation, and residual harm. Also, understanding sources of harm to the community may require recognition of incentives. Likelihood is the probability or chance that an event will occur. Risk is a combination of the likelihood of an occurrence of a hazardous event or exposure and the severity of the impact. An example of this would be the injury, illness, or environmental impact that may be caused by the event or exposure. A risk analysis is a systematic process to understand the nature and deduce the level of risk. This risk assessment will be carried out in accordance with leading practice for health and safety risk management. A qualitative risk methodology will be followed utilizing a risk assessment and control document as the risk assessment template. This template is available with the email link that was sent through to you. A risk determination matrix will be used for the evaluation of risks. This is only one type of a risk assessment. So for more information on different risk assessment types, please contact us and we will give you as much advice as we can on HIRA, risk assessments, as well as a continual-based risk assessment program. Let us first consider the control effectiveness rating or hierarchy of controls. The addition of control effectiveness consideration to the basic risk assessment control provides an opportunity to further discuss each control and the sum of all controls for an unwanted event. There are many ways to establish control effectiveness ranging in complexity from simple to complex. A relatively simple method called the Control Effectiveness Rating or CER has been developed to generate and record subjective ratings of control based on two dimensions: control type and control quality. Control type is based on the hierarchy of controls. Control quality offers percentage choices for control reliability and availability. A method of combining the two dimensions will be discussed. The control type in the risk assessment indicator by color gives the general effectiveness of that control, where green is a good quality or a very effective control, and yellow and red are less adequate. The definition of elimination is the complete elimination of the hazard by design. If elimination is not possible, we will refer to the substitute or minimize control. This is replacing the hazard, material or process with a less hazardous one, or significantly reducing the magnitude of the hazard or material so consequences are greatly reduced. Engineering controls are used to design in controls or redesign the equipment or work process, making them a lot safer. You can separate a risk, placing a physical barrier on the hazard by guarding or enclosing it. One of the two lowest forms of control is administrative, providing controls such as training and procedures. The last line of defense and the least effective control is PPE, the use of appropriate and properly fitted PPE where other controls are not practical. Please remember that whether you have chosen any control type, you must ensure that the quality of the control is then looked at. The quality of a control can be based on several factors. Number one, reliability. Will the control you have put in place operate on demand as intended? Is there survivability to the control? Will it remain unimpaired during the unwanted event? And is it available? Will it be available to perform its function during that specific task? This is a basic 5x5 module of a risk assessment matrix. This matrix has on the left-hand side the severity impact of risk to business, environment, or health and safety. On the right-hand side, you will notice a 5x5 block. On the left-hand side of this is insignificant, minor, moderate, major, and catastrophic. These make up the 5 consequences or severity rating for a risk. Along the top of the 5 columns is the probability or likelihood of consequence, ranging from very unlikely, less than once in 3 years, to almost certain, more than once a week or even daily. The way a risk matrix works is based on the actual risk consequence to health and safety, environment, or business. We will increase in risk rating based on the severity or consequence noted down, as well as the probability or likelihood of that risk occurring. Let us now take a look at a template of a risk assessment within this Excel spreadsheet. We start off with the number or step within the sequence that we are performing. In this case, the first thing that we need to do is stack materials. The source of a hazard to stacking materials would be the manual handling of such materials, and this could have an effect on our safety. It could also have an impact on our health. However, we will separate these two in order to give a proper risk assessment to both the effect of risk to health and the effect of risk to safety. In the risk to safety, we see our risk impact as lacerations, abrasions, scratches, cuts, bruises, shiners, strains, stresses, torn muscles, or ligaments. If you have any associated reported incidents within the past 3 years, it would be a good idea to note it down on the risk assessment here. Now we look at our raw risk rating. What would be the impact or consequence to our safety? Looking at our 5x5 module, we see the severity here as a medium severity, noted down as a 3. We then note down that the probability or likelihood is not very common with this type of work. And again, it is noted as a low probability. The algorithm used here to denote the risk or raw risk rating would be 3 times 1, or severity times probability. This will give you a raw risk rating of 3. Now, we look at the appropriate controls or engineering and administrative controls that need to be implemented in order to protect our employees from lacerations, abrasions, scratches, or bruises when manually handling stacked materials. In this case, we are looking at very light materials, and that is why our risk assessment or raw risk rating has come down to a low risk or green risk rating. It depends on what you are performing within your company. You see, if you are using a lot heavier boxes, if you needed to use a ladder to reach to get the box, there are many different risk ratings that will be coming out for the different type of tasks, even though the same task is being handled, the stacking of materials or the manual handling of materials. In each instance, please ensure that an approved competent risk assessor is carrying out this risk assessment. But the design of this is just to show you how a risk assessment is accomplished. And so the appropriate control measures that we would put in place is that minimal equipment is to be carried at any time. Should more than one piece of equipment need to be carried, a buddy system is to be implemented to get the help that you need. And all employees need to be trained on the correct manual handling of materials and equipment, and this training must be recorded in the operational file. This comes down to the safe working procedure for manual handling of that specific material. Now, the effectiveness of controls here is not a very high rating, simply because we are only implementing an administrative control. So please remember that you always look at your effectiveness of controls or hierarchy of controls to see what type of control implementation you are setting in. If our raw risk was a lot higher, as you see in the highlighted section on the bottom of this column, you will notice that that grayed out area, the use of hand tools, has got a higher raw risk. That is because the probability or likelihood of something going wrong within that area is higher than the manual handling. And so that gives you a risk rating of 6. Then it comes down to the actual appropriate controls, where we have a lot more controls in place. In fact, we even have engineering controls in place for that risk. That is why the effectiveness of control is rated at a 40. And then we can minimize that residual risk down to a level 4. But coming back to item number 1, we want to implement the appropriate controls, but we also never want to forget the PPE requirements. Although PPE is the last form of defense in occupational health and safety, it is a mandatory item. And so overalls, safety boots that have steel caps, as well as safety gloves need to be used while manually handling these items. The effectiveness of control is rated as a 20 for administrative controls, and our residual risk remains the same. However, it is safe to continue because we have achieved as low as reasonably possible with this risk. So, have we achieved an acceptable risk level? Yes. However, we still want to monitor it, and that means our supervisor or manager needs to perform a planned task observation at regular intervals for this specific task. We will not need any additional controls since we have achieved acceptable risk. Should we not have achieved acceptable risk, then we must put in additional controls for any risk that has a residual risk rating of more than 4. We will then allocate a responsible person in order to monitor this. We will give them a target date, as well as ensure that the status is in progress, completed, or to be done. A green control rating indicates that the control should be very effective. This is, of course, the desired effectiveness of every control. But the design matrix indicates that even at a high quality percentage, administrative or PPE control is not considered to be an effective control. The intent of this design is to promote the development and application of harder controls, such as engineering or substitution. A yellow control rating indicates a satisfactory control that could be improved to a green either through improving its quality or by changing its type. Yellow control should be improved if total control effectiveness for an unwanted event is inadequate. A red control rating indicates that the control does not contribute effectively to reducing the risk of an unwanted event. In this case, we would not continue with the task. There are many hazard types. Let us take a look at a few of these and how you need to apply them to your risk assessment. Be sure to look out for these various hazard types and make sure that they are actually written on the risk assessment. As a health and safety representative, you need to look out for the health and safety of the employees you represent. If an employee comes to you with any concerns in terms of health and safety, or with any concerns in terms of the risk assessment, it is good for you to know and understand that risk assessment, as well as the hazard type that the employee might be affected by. In this instance, working at heights would be a physical hazard, since you have the potential to fall in, fall on, or fall from. There are many other physical hazards. Can you name a few? A fire hazard is the potential for harm by exposure to a fire or a burning mass of material. This would include anything such as hot works, like welding, soldering, or due to electric cable faults. There are two types of mechanical hazards. A fixed mechanical hazard, which is the potential for harm by exposure to interaction with sources of fixed mechanical energy, including those powered by electrical, hydraulic, pneumatic, or combustion. A mobile mechanical hazard is the potential for harm by exposure to interaction with sources of mobile or self-propelled mechanical energy. These also include handheld items such as electrical, hydraulic, pneumatic, or combustion-held hand tools. We are no stranger to biological hazards, which is the potential for harm by viruses and bacteria. Even though there is a repeal of the above regulations for COVID-19, it is not specifically directed at employers and their workplaces. All employers still have an obligation in terms of the Occupational Health and Safety Act to provide, insofar as is reasonably practicably possible, a safe working environment. This is in line with a code of practice, managing exposure to SARS-CoV-2 in the workplace, as well as the hazardous biological agents regulations. Please ensure you include this in your COVID-19 management plans. In terms of the hazardous biological agents regulations, COVID-19 is classified as a Group 3 hazardous biological agent. This presents a risk in respect of an agent that may cause severe human disease, which presents a serious hazard to exposed persons, and which may present a risk of spreading to the community. Where there is a risk of exposure to COVID-19 in the workplace, an employer must conduct a further risk assessment before determining whether employees are no longer required to wear masks and revise their workplace plan. Since you are still at risk of COVID-19, and as part of this risk assessment, employers must ensure that an employee's risk of exposure to COVID-19 is limited through appropriate workplace measures, such as vaccination, the wearing of masks, practicing social distancing, and sanitizing. These kinds of precautions may be necessary especially in workplaces where there is a high risk of COVID-19 transmission, such as those in healthcare and mining. In these workplaces, employers may still insist that employees continue wearing masks in the workplace as part of their risk assessment, regardless of the latest regulations. Remember, we all have a responsibility toward health and safety. Where there is a minimal risk of exposure to COVID-19 in a workplace, employees should not be required to wear masks. Notwithstanding this, employers should still encourage employees to continue taking necessary precautions such as social distancing and sanitizing to limit the transmission of COVID-19 in the workplace. Do you have a copy of the latest regulations? Please get in touch with us at info@ohss.co.za. Hazardous chemical substance hazards is the potential for harm by chemicals, including acids, alkalis, organic substances, such as gases, fuels, lubricants, degreasers, solvents, and paints, as well as any ozone-depleting substances. By performing your tasks every day, you could expose yourself to ergonomic hazards. These could be exertion, excessive or unnatural or repetitive movements, poor posture, or other undesired physical stress on the human body. When using tools or equipment, you have the potential for harm by exposure to sudden or prolonged exposure to excessive noise. This could include noise-induced hearing loss. We all are exposed to work environment hazards, such as temperature, lighting, and ventilation, which will impact each person in different ways. Lone working, excessive hours, or overworking, as well as stress and traveling to and from work, all pose a workplace environment hazard that can create various unwanted situations that could impact a person.